What is up, Nets world? After a brief hiatus during the dead period of the NBA offseason, we're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. But before anything, if you don't already, make sure to subscribe to Believe in Nets on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Also subscribe to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA, where I'll be posting these podcasts, as well as other content, film breakdowns, interviews throughout the Nets season. But we had NBA Media Day yesterday, all teams across the association getting things underway. The Nets took place at HSS Training Center in Brooklyn. I was there. We had the first day of training camp practice today and spoke with Jordi Fernandez, Cam Thomas, some other players, talked to everybody yesterday. But a lot of interesting content, and things are really getting into the swing of things for this new rebuilding Nets squad. So a lot of exciting questions for a team that is going in a completely new direction. And I'm going to have Brian Lewis from the New York Post, who is a frequent visitor to this podcast, on to answer our 5 most burning questions entering the 2024-25 season for the Brooklyn Nets. Also had some main takeaways from Media Day, notable quotes and other things. Hope you guys enjoy all of that after the theme music. I'm joined now by the New York Post, Brian Lewis, a recurring guest on this podcast. And today, the two of us are going to be answering our top 5 burning questions ahead of the 2024-25 Nets season. But before that, Brian, we're fresh off of Media Day. We're fresh off of the first day of Nets training camp. Any takeaways from what we heard from the Nets coaching staff and the Nets players from these first couple of days?
Well, I'd say probably one of the more notable things was to hear Cam Thomas, who I fully believe will be their leading scorer and is rapidly becoming the face of the franchise, talk about how he has things to prove still. I thought that was noteworthy. That's something of a heel turn from what he said yesterday. So I thought that was both notable and a good sign. Jordi clearly has a demeanor about him that's positive, but without being Pollyannish. He's going to be giving people, obviously, room to make mistakes, but he's also not going to expect them repeatedly to be the same mistakes over and over. But, I mean, for the most part, I think what you saw and heard was what you would expect to see and hear on the first day of training camp.
And those were pretty much the 2 things that I was going to hit on as my takeaways. And to give a little context to the Cam Thomas quote that Brian is referring to. So during Media Day yesterday, we heard Cam say that he doesn't feel like he has anything to prove. And if there is, still things to be proven on his end, that, he doesn't know what to say, and he's proven himself time and time again. But in that context, it seems like he was talking about to the Nets front office, because the question that was asked to him was, Sean Marks is said he's looking for the next Nets. Who are those guys going to be? He's still trying to identify his team. And Cam responded and said, he's still looking for his team. Like, that's his deal, but I don't feel like I have anything to prove. Today, he said that he does have things to prove, a heel turn, as Brian said. But in this context, it seems like he was referring to the Nets coaching staff, Jordi Fernandez, a new group of coaches in here who are going to be establishing minutes and things along those lines. So it seemed like Cam's it was nice to hear Cam say that, because for him to say that he has nothing to prove, even in the sense of to the Nets front office, I thought was an interesting thing to say on Media Day. Not the biggest deal, but interesting, because he's a guy who, played, self-proclaimed that last year was his rookie season in a lot of ways. So, he has done a lot of impressive things, led the Nets in scoring. Obviously has had, historic scoring outbursts, but still a player who there's extreme and immense questions about across the league, especially within a lot of front offices. So you would think there are things to prove on that end. And at least he said today that in the context of the coaching staff and earning his minutes and earning that number one lead scoring role that a lot of people have already, assigned to him, he still thinks that there are things to prove in that regard. And in regards to Jordy Fernandez, he said a lot of things. It seems like he said all the right things. He said, no minutes will be promised, no starting spots, rotation roles, none of that will be promised. People are going to earn their roles. He said, veterans, young guys, it doesn't matter. All the things that you would expect to hear from a coach. But the way that he said it and the way that he's described, his approach with the players, it seems like he, has a good presence around him. And it seems like a guy who, while a first-time head coach, should be able to garner the respect of a lot of these players for this new look Nets team. But rolling now on into our top 5 questions ahead of the 2024-25 season for a Nets team that is fresh off of a action-packed offseason and really set themselves on an entire new course. Question number 1, wanted to stay on the topic of Cam Thomas because we just touched on a little bit of what he said these last couple of days, but Cam is obviously entering this season as the Nets' perceived number 1 offensive option. And, Brian, that's really an interesting development because this is a guy who his first 2 seasons was not a part of the rotation. Last season opened the year on coming off the bench, and even midway through last year, had some brief stretches where his minutes were not guaranteed and were in question by Jock Vaughn and the prior coaching staff. And this quickly, he's now perceived as number 1 scorer, lead guy for them, 10th in the betting odds to lead the NBA in scoring. So what are fair expectations for Cam Thomas this season in your eyes?
Well, I do think it's fair, and you point out correctly, that he had an uphill battle seeming to earn Jacques Vaughn's trust. From the point that Kevin Ollie replaced Jacques, I think he averaged 25.2 points a game from the All-Star break on. I think while it was completely unreasonable for people to expect Mikal Bridges to have averaged 29 or whatever it was for an entire season, because that's just not who he is. He's a guy that plays off the ball, doesn't look for that many shots. Cam is a bucket. And if you just take the reins off of him, he will shoot. So I do think it's reasonable to think he could be in that vicinity for the entirety of the season. How efficient that'll be, I don't know, because he'll face everybody's best perimeter defender. He'll be facing all sorts of junk defenses, box and ones here, doubles, blitzes. So he's going to have to work for his points, but I do think it's reasonable to think that he will be among the scoring leaders, and he will probably, I could see him averaging at least that for the entirety of the season. May not be the most efficient 25 or 25 and change, 26, but I do think it's fair to think that he could put those numbers up for the entire season.
I definitely think that's fair. And I mean, you look at over the whole course of last season, he led the Nets in scoring at 22.5 points per game. And that was with his minutes, sometimes being in flux, came back from an injury earlier in the year. And, you say he can be towards the top of the league in scoring. And I don't doubt that Cam has the skill set or the confidence or willingness to shoot per se to be able to do something like that. But, my question would be, obviously, there's not a lot of guys on this Nets team who can score. So they're going to need Cam to score, and they're going to be they're going to be one of the worst teams in the league, regardless of whether or not he's scoring a lot. But the question that I would pose is, how badly do the Nets even want him to be towards the top of the league in scoring if it comes at the cost of sacrificing efficiency or potentially creating bad habits? Because, if you're looking at a guy like Cam, I think we saw a pretty, not a drastic by any means, but some marginal steps in development in terms of his willingness to read coverages, to make easy passes, to take what the defense gives him, and to just be a little bit more of a willing passer to get his teammates involved. Even some nice plays and reads down the end where he was reading coverages and doing a nice job of kind of recognizing the different defenses that teams were throwing at him. So, my expectations for Cam, I think he can very well be a mid-20s scorer. The questions are, can he maintain at least or hopefully raise his efficiency as a shooter? Because I did think we saw some encouraging signs. Cam finished well at the rim last year. more notably, I think that he shot around 43% on catch and shoot threes last year, which really bodes well for his long-term potential and, scheme versatility, because on a championship team, I think it's fair to say that he's not going to be a 1A guy on a roster like that. So if he wants to be down the line, he's going to have to be used to playing off the ball. So that's good. Then he also averaged, around 4 assists per game over a 2-month stretch late in the year. So can he do those things? Can he, elevate his teammates even just marginally from a playmaking standpoint while maintaining his efficiency as a scorer? I think those are the questions. I think it's what, we heard Jordy Fernandez already talk about it. And I think that, they're approaching this from a good headspace of Cam, of really taking a look at his skill set in his game and where they can maximize it. But before we move on to the next question, it's what do you get the senses around the league? Because Cam has been a polarizing player since he entered the league amongst the Nets coaching staffs, amongst the Nets fan base. And from people I've talked to, it sounds like across front offices as well, because people just don't know how to evaluate him, not just because he didn't play early on in his career, because when he has played, it's been in such strange circumstances some of the time. So what's the sense that you get when you just talk to people around the league about how they evaluate Cam and his skill set and kind of project what he can be moving forward?
Well, he is the player that I personally have found the hardest to get a handle on his value around the league. That when I say value, I mean that in a number of ways. I mean, in terms of what kind of offer sheets he'll get, presuming that he hits restricted free agency next summer. In terms of how coveted he is, shall we say, by other front offices, I can't get a gauge on it. I think when you ask when you ask front office personnel around the league, what do you think of Cam Johnson? Pretty much all of them have the same kind of answer. They have a certain range that they think he's worth. If you ask them, what about Mikal Bridges? Oh, great guy, great team, blah, 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 wonderful, wish we had, etc. With Cam Thomas, there is no sort of baseline. Some scouts, they think he walks on water. They love him. They say, oh, he's a bucket. Oh, he's this, he's that. Others wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. They want no part of it. No matter what he's getting paid, they don't want any part of it. I've never seen a player like this, frankly. That is, when I say he's divisive, I don't mean that he's divisive in the locker room and that guys don't get along with him. I mean, there is no sort of agreement between scouts or front office personnel what his value is on the market or how good of a player can he be, which I'm sure just makes things very difficult when Sean Marks and company are trying to gauge what he is, because nobody can seem to agree on what he is.
And that's so interesting. And, just so everybody knows, and I'm sure people have heard this from both of us already, but the Nets right now today are entering a 3-week window to negotiate a rookie scale extension with Cam Thomas. Now, the presumption has been that they will hold off until next summer in order to maximize their 2025 cap space. And they can do that by waiting to sign Cam until after using the rest of their cap space, because they can then use his bird rights to exceed the cap. And basically all that matters is they can have more cap space if they wait to extend him and let him hit restricted free agency. But, I think everything you said is spot on. And from, management people on teams, media people I've talked to, that seems to be the consensus amongst everybody. And for Cam, that's why I think this is such an interesting season, because it's almost like he's caught in the middle of these two places of where he's the number one scorer for this team, bad team. Everybody saw, like you heard Zach Lowe and Bobby Marks talk about it. He's going to take 1,000,000 shots. He'll lead the NBA in shots and all that. And that's fine and great if he wants to average close to 30 points a game. But what I said earlier about that coming at the cost of efficiency, and I think that if that is the direction that the season goes, that could almost make it even more difficult for some front offices to evaluate him, because I think a lot of front offices no matter how good he plays on this bad Nets team this year, that's not the role that they are going to envision him potentially playing on a title team. So for me, the question really comes down to, for Cam, can he be an efficient enough scorer to be a top 2 option on a playoff team? Like, that is the baseline that I would set, not just like this season. He's only 22 years old, but moving forward at any point in his career. Because if the answer to that is no over the course of his career, it's going to be hard for him to be a starter on a playoff or title contending team because, he doesn't have the skill set that would warrant that if he's not efficient enough of a scorer. He's an undersized guy who up to this point in his career is a subpar defender. And if you look at the guards across the NBA who are undersized around his size, who are top 2 options on playoff teams, we're talking about guys like Steph Curry, now Jalen Brunson, Kyrie Irving, Donovan Mitchell. I think nobody thinks that he's going to be Steph or, even where Jalen Brunson is at, Kyrie, like Donovan Mitchell. Like, can he approach the level of those guys at any point in his career? Because, if not, it seems like there are 2 outcomes that might be realistic in that sense. And it might be, as some people have talked about, as like a supercharged 6-man scorer, like Jordan Clarkson or whatever comp you want to make in that kind of role. Or is he just going to be one of those good stats, bad teams guys? So it's interesting. There's a lot of different angles of Cam, from the dynamic that his Nets career has played out up to this point to how he's viewed across the leagues. And how I think that this season is a really interesting point of him getting a full year of being a member in a rotation, or a second full year of that, and trying to see, can he be more than just one of those guys? And can he do things and round out the supporting aspects of his game to show that, he could have potentially maybe turn some front offices and some people who don't think that, like you said, they wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. Can he sway some opinions based off of development that maybe some people thought that he wouldn't make? But at the same time, he's in a role where, it's going to be tempting to just chuck up shots and kind of feed into what had been the narrative about him as a player. So really interesting, a lot of angles, and I'm sure that we'll talk about Cam Thomas a ton throughout the season. But moving on to the next question, we're coming off the NBA offseason. It's training camp time. So that it's time to talk about Ben Simmons. It's time to talk about Ben Simmons' health. Can Ben Simmons return to being anything near Ben Simmons? We've heard the same thing again this year. It's like deja vu to me, but he's a guy that, when healthy, this team seems to think can be a very impactful player. And when he has been healthy in his career, he has been an impactful player. The problem is, since joining the Nets, he's never healthy. So, is that going to change this year? Potentially. But the question posed is, what is Ben Simmons' role for this team? And, should he even have a role? If he does, what does that look like? Brian, your opinion on this? You're a guy who's covered a lot of Ben Simmons stuff.
Well, okay. What do I think his role is? On opening night? I think his role probably is starting point guard on opening night. Listen, when Ben is healthy, and I know I can hear like all the energy and the mental and the snickering and whatnot, but when Ben is healthy, he makes a difference, right? Now, whether that's taking you from good to very good or subpar to average and mediocre, whatever it is, but he's made a difference. When you look at him over the last 2 years, when he's played, now understanding that some of that was with Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, etc. But the fact of the matter is, when he's played, they've been on a 45 win pace. When he hasn't played, they've been on a 35 win pace. So I don't care how bad or good this team is. Either way, dropping Ben Simmons into the middle of it makes them exponentially better. But I would never sit here and try to predict his health. That's a recipe for failure. I'm not going to try to predict that. What I would say is, he seems healthy now. He seems healthy today on the first day of training camp. And if he's healthy for the first day of the regular season, when I look at that roster, it's not good enough for him not to be in the lineup. So I think he will be the starting point guard. However you manage to do that. Now, does that mean you start him along with Dennis at some point. I guess you could. But, I also have questions if you're going to start Ben and Nick Claxton. I need every possible bit of shooting that I can on the floor to make that work. So I'm not sure that that's Dennis. So I'm not sure exactly what his role is, other than it's probably going to be influential and right in the middle of everything that they're doing at the start of the season, and they can sit there and cross their fingers and ride that as long as it lasts.
All right, so a lot of different things and to unpack, a lot of different angles there, but just the thing that I don't understand about this whole Ben Simmons, I didn't understand it a ton last year.
There's many that I don't understand about.
Yeah,
but yes.
but this whole, like, we've done this now. This is now the third year in a row that we're doing this, and what I really don't understand, just from the health standpoint, all right, if the line is if Ben is healthy, he's effective, which I'm not, gonna disagree with. Now, does he have limitations, and is it dependent on other players? Yes, but he is effective in a vacuum when he's healthy. Now, if we're looking at his health, he obviously had that first back surgery during the 2022 offseason. He tried to play during what was the 2022-23 season. He played half the season, then he had to be shut down due to a nerve impingement in the back. Then he sits out for 7 months. We got the whole tour last offseason about how he's feeling the greatest he's felt since joining the Nets. He's ready to dominate people, all that. He played, 7 games before he was forced out for 3 months again by a back injury. Then he comes back. He plays, 8 more games, and then he's forced out again and has to get another back surgery. So you put out the number, I've put out the number, everybody's put out the number of how many games he's played. It's like 57 of 210 or whatever over the last 3 seasons. So what I don't understand is what is lending any confidence that he's going to be healthy, because this is what we saw the Nets do last season to start the year when Jacques Vaughn very reluctantly gave Ben Simmons the starting point guard role, said he has to play a certain way. He tried to do that somewhat, was still afraid to shoot and get to the free throw line. He took 15 free throws in 15 games last year, but he wasn't healthy again. And we saw that cost the Nets. And I asked Jordy about this today at practice, because when Ben is in the lineup as a starter with Nick Claxton, the Nets play basketball differently than they do when Ben Simmons is not in the lineup and it's just Nick Claxton out there. It's two contrasting styles. And that's something that had such an effect on the team that we actually heard Mikal Bridges reference it after that Boston loss, right before Jacques Vaughn got fired, when they lost by 50 points. I mean, you were there for that game in Boston. He said, we play one way with Ben on the court and one way with Ben off the court. So I don't understand why, even if the Nets were trying to be competitive this year, I wouldn't understand it, because they're playing two different styles. And from everything, we have an extended sample size of Ben not being able to be in the lineup. So by making him the starting point guard, you're putting the team in a position where they're going to have to adjust to a completely different style of basketball in the starting lineup if he is forced out by injury, which everything that we've seen up to this point lends you to believe that he will be. Now, that's if they were trying to be competitive. Then you add in the fact that they're trying to tank this year, and I don't understand it at all then. Because, Brian, let me just pose the question to you then. What is the upside of making Ben a feature part of this team right now? And with his injury history, with his fit, the need to fit things around him, and with the fact that they're not even trying to be competitive, and with Ben's timeline, like, what is the upside of it all? What's leading them to do that? Like, what are they hoping to get from that? Is it grace around the league for treating a big name the right way or whatever? Just like your opinion, because it's something that I don't really understand.
Well, it's tough because it really does back Sean into a corner. Sean Marks, general manager. Here's the thing. I don't think, players don't tank, right? They don't. Mm-hmm. Organizations tank, right? Owners will make that decision. General managers will make that decision, and we'll put those over on the left. And then over on the right, you've got players that go out and they try to win. And coaches sometimes caught in the middle, but
Yeah.
they try to win, right? So when you ask me what the upside is, the upside may be completely different for the players and the coach than the upside might be for the front office, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do believe that they feel that a healthy Ben Simmons, I keep saying that phrase, but a healthy Ben Simmons gives them a better chance to win games on a random Tuesday in Cleveland or a random Saturday in Sacramento, right? Now, if you go on the assumption that overall they're better off winning 18 games or 19 games, well, that's a different story. Now that's a mess, right? The entire situation would be a mess if you're assuming that, okay, if Ben Simmons comes out and plays well, and you also presume that he's gone one way or the other, he is lowering your chances of getting whoever, Cooper
Yeah.
or Dylan Harper or whoever you want, Ace Bailey, and then he's going to flitter off and leave at the end of the season. That's a that's a valid argument.
Yeah. No.
And that's a legitimate worry. But that is where they are. That's the position that they find themselves in. So Jordy, in his first go-round as a head coach, is going to try to win games. And he believes, probably rightfully so, that they are better suited to win some games if he has a healthy Ben Simmons. Now, that's part of the reason why I asked him. I said, well, let's say one player outperforms a second player, but second player may fit better with a certain lineup. How do you do that? He said, I don't have to make that decision right now.
That's a good answer by a first-time head coach. But all right, so and I agree with pretty much everything you said from their process standpoint. Like I think it was very well put the way you said players definitely don't tank, at least admittedly. Like they might not play as hard because the situation is getting very bleak, but players are playing to win. They don't benefit from tanking. Organizations tank, and I think you put it very well that coaches are sometimes caught in the middle. The way I think it should go is organizations tank. They decide what players are available to coaches, to start a season and on given nights throughout the season. And the coach always does his best to win with the players that are given to him. That way, I think that's the way that it should operate. The thing that I'm going to disagree with is saying even aside from the fact that the Nets as an organization aren't even trying to win. So this is such a weird thing to even argue about with Ben Simmons. But if they are trying to win from Jordy's standpoint, I don't think that even putting Ben Simmons out there in the starting lineup with Nick Claxton gives them the best chance to win because, you asked Jordy about this. I asked Jordy about this again today. And we've seen the Ben Simmons, Nick Claxton fit briefly. We saw it last season for about 100 minutes. I'm pretty sure I wrote about this yesterday. I think they had a negative 23 net rating in 100 minutes, which a minuscule sample size, but that is horrendous. Now, Jordy admitted that, but said a small sample size, pretty much saying we throw that out. We can't take anything from that. But then says the year before that, Nick and Ben they had a good numbers, on the floor together and their splits and all that. But it's conveniently leaves out the fact that Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving were two of the other players sharing the court with them, two of the greatest isolation scorers in the history of basketball, which I don't think we're going to see players, of that reach approach that level on this current Nets team. Can Cam Thomas score the ball? Sure. Can other guys on the team maybe step in and give you some spot buckets, off self-creation? Sure. But I don't believe in that pairing at all. And I don't even understand the thing that the Nets should be prioritizing most this season, the front office is going to prioritize getting a top pick. But if we're talking about the second priority, it should be developing these young players and a lot of these guys and putting them in a situation where they're playing in the half court with two non-shooters and having to work around that. We've seen how that looks without KD and Kyrie for, brief, but we've seen a taste of it. And it's looked very ugly. So even if they are trying to win, I just disagree. that Ben and Nick pairing gives them the best chance to. And that's not even factoring in the fact that Ben gets hurt all the time. And it's going to change the style and make these young players have to adjust to it in a year where a lot of them are trying to get their footing and get acclimated to being part of an NBA offense. So, there's a lot of angles to this Ben thing. I just thought at this point, I thought this year we'd be done with it. I thought there was potential that maybe they could talk about a buyout ahead of this season, but it didn't seem like that was ever something that was actually considered. And, it may sound like I'm killing Ben. Like, I'm not trying to. I want Ben to be healthy. Like, Ben is an electrifying player when he's healthy. He just hasn't been healthy. And at this juncture of where the Nets are at in their timeline, I don't think that it makes a lot of sense. Just the whole thing just doesn't make sense to me. I will add, though, that you've been around the Nets for a long time. I've followed the Nets my whole life. A lot of Nets fans will know what I'm talking about. It would be very Nets for this to be the year that Ben Simmons stays healthy and returns to all-star form and elevates this team to winning a few games that they shouldn't. But I guess we'll just see how that all plays out. Third question: which veterans on this team are traded? And, how does it impact the rotation? Because as we know, the guys, it's Cam Johnson, it's Dorian Finney-Smith, Dennis Schroeder, and even Bojan Bogdanovic, who isn't healthy to start the season. But those are the 4 veterans who clearly do not fit this timeline. And, Sean and Cam and Dorian, we asked all of them about it, said there's been an open line of communication about, what it could look like. They want to be in the loop if there are trade negotiations, and the expectation is that there will be. But if you had to make a prediction, what do you think of those veterans? Who could have the most value and who will be on the move potentially?
Most value, probably Cam Johnson.
Yep.
And I know people can, debate the contract and so forth. But, as the cap goes up, that contract becomes more and more palatable.
Yep.
I would say he has the most value and the highest ask. So I would think that the most likely to get traded earlier would be Dorian.
Mm-hmm.
I think the ask might be lower on Dorian. And also when you consider he's not an expiring contract, but he's got a player option. I think it's $15 million. 3-and-D guys are going to get that much money, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to assume he's going to opt out and become a free agent, which means if you don't move him, you get nothing for him. So if I had to put them in order, I would think Dorian would be the most likely to get traded and the earliest. Then Cam. Dennis, really, frankly, if we go on the assumption that Ben's health is unreliable, you're really back in the same situation you were when you had Spencer. And you had Spencer Dinwiddie, and it didn't matter what he did or how he played. You had to play him because you had no other options. So if Ben is not healthy, you have Dennis Schroeder, and you're going to have to play him, whether he plays well or not. For the moment, I'm moving aside, guys like Killian Hayes because he's a camp invite and he's not completely on the roster yet, right? So Dennis is a little bit tricky to trade. And Bogey, I'm going to put him to the side because right now he's not even cleared for 3-on-3, much less actually playing. So I'll put him to the side for a minute.
Yeah.
When he's cleared and playing, then I guess I can think about whether he's tradable.
And I agree with you, and I think the consensus is that Johnson has the most value. Finney-Smith is probably a close second just because, Johnson's younger, better shooter, but then Finney-Smith second because he is a 3-and-D guy, and that's a player archetype that is highly valued, especially among contenders who are trying to add a piece to their rotation. But, it is difficult to find trades for these guys, and it is an exercise that I've run throughout the offseason because I was just curious and looking at the spots. Now, did I find no trades? No, I made some, and I might write a piece about it in the coming weeks. But, if you just look at these guys, they do make some money. I think Cam's contract is going to be viewed favorably because the cap is expected to rise probably by 10% for the next few years due to the TV deal. But, not a ton of teams have the ability to easily match his number, because if you're looking at his contract for this coming year, a little bit above 20 million, teams who are below, like, and the CBA adds a whole nother wrinkle to this, because teams who are below the first apron and don't have to match his money have to trade about $16 million to match Cam. For Dorian, that number is only like 7.3 million. So you can see right there, like, a lot easier to match Dorian than Cam. If you're above the first apron, teams have to match both of their salaries. And if you're above the second apron, they have to match both of the salaries without aggregating their own contract. So just 1-for-1 trades. So, I think some people were surprised that those guys were not moved ahead of the season. But, the more I thought about it, I wasn't, because if you're looking at teams, they're going to need like mid-sized salaries to make deals like that work. And January 15th is really the date that, Pete fans should have marked down, because that's the date where free agents signed during this last offseason are able to be traded by their new teams. So that's the date where it's kind of the start of trade season. And a lot of teams that might not have the mid-sized salaries to make a deal like that right now will have that, come that date. But even then, Cam's an interesting guy because he's 6'8". He shot, I think, 41% from three over his last 3 seasons on like 6 attempts per game. Can guard well enough where he's a player that should be valued, but at the same time, he's had a lot of injuries throughout his career, had a lot of injuries last season, and there's not a ton of title contenders that want to pay, 20 plus million for a guy who probably, if they're a really, really high level team, he might not even be in the starting lineup. And on a lot of these teams, he probably won't be in the starting lineup. So, that's what makes Cam interesting. And that's why it's difficult to find some trades, because of that number. I said they need 16 million to match his contract. And I think you wrote earlier during the offseason, the Nets have had a consistently high asking price for him. So if we're talking about the Nets want a contending team to give up at least $16 million in salary, which is going to be a player, a chunk salary, and get first round draft compensation, getting both of those things for a guy like Cam, who, while in theory can be a very impactful player, has injury history and probably won't be a starter on a lot of these teams, that could be difficult. So, that is why I think right now it could be difficult to find trades for him. But that's why it's also beneficial to wait until the trade deadline, because as I said, all those new free agents can be traded at that point. Every year, guys get hurt. Teams start out slower than they thought they were going to. Teams have a better sense of their rotation. Some teams might get desperate and look at a Cam Johnson and say, hey, this guy's 6'8", shoots 40% from three on high volume. They can talk themselves into it really easily. But before we talk about how those veterans could impact the rotation this year early on before they're traded, just what I said, you've reported that the Nets have had a consistently high asking price for Cam. Just like, what have you heard in that regard? And do you have any specifics on what that asking price could potentially be?
Well, I mean, I'm led to believe that they wanted multiple first-round draft picks for Cam. Now, not all, as you well know, not all first-rounders are equal.
Yep.
Right? I wish I knew exactly whose first-rounders they wanted, who they're talking to, what kind of protections are being discussed. I wish I knew. And if I knew, I'd write it, but I don't. But I do know that their ask has been higher, which is the reason he's here. Now, I would say it's more important to get, how should I say, an appropriate trade or quality trade than it is to get a convenient trade. In other words, from their point of view, they are better suited waiting and getting a trade or a deal that they like rather than getting the first option. It's not like they have to get these people off their roster. That's not the situation. They want to get a trade that they feel benefits them. And yeah, I mean, you talked about, half jokingly, talking about, well, this could be the year that Ben stays healthy and he essentially ruins their tank. And I say this with all due respect to Dorian or to Cam. When you just take a look at what you figure the season-ending war of any of those players is going to be, let's be fair, it does not make a difference whether you trade them in November or whether you trade them in December or whether you traded them last week. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you get the right trade.
And,
right?
you know,
a third of a season of Dorian Finney-Smith is not going to tangibly change the campaign that you're having or tangibly change where you are in the lottery. It really isn't. What does matter is whether you get the right deal for him.
And I think that line right there can, you know, that could be a good point and a good, you know, I don't know, I'm struggling to find the word here, but it could be a good representation of why their value might not be incredibly high to some of these other teams. Because, you know, while it might not be fair because like they're role players, they're 3-and-D players, they're not built to elevate a team drastically like the Nets, who are lacking shot creation and all those things. But at the same time, if you're asking for multiple first-round picks and you're going to need $16 million in salary for a guy like Cam Johnson, if a contender is giving that up, now, like we said, all first-round picks aren't created equal, but still, that kind of package, you're hoping to get a player who is a somewhat of a needle mover for a contending team. And, you know, it's sort of apple to oranges because we're talking about impact for a Nets team that's tanking versus a contending team, which is completely different. But if they're not a guy that's elevating the Nets team significantly in this season, I think it's a fair, at least in negotiations, it's something that a rival front office would have in their heads of, hey, he might, like, they could use that as, you know, their argument, you know, in theory. But, you know, that is why I think it could be difficult to find some deals. Will the Nets find deals for these guys if they want to? I definitely think they can. Multiple first-round picks for Cam Johnson. I find that very far-fetched at this point. I think one first-round pick and probably a late first is realistic for Dorian. I think we're looking at something, a young player and or seconds. It could be we could be looking at a deal similar to the Royce O'Neal trade or, you know, along those lines of value, but we'll see. And, you know, I think that those conversations will heat up, and I might have some hypothetical trade partners coming out here soon. But the second part of this that I wanted to talk about is just,
I did want to point out that when I say two, one, that's old. That's not like yesterday. Mm-hmm. And two, that also does deal with the equivalency. So the player that you're returning might be valued as
yes. Yes. Okay.
Right. It's not necessarily saying, oh, you're getting a $20 million player and 2 lottery picks. That's not. And I know people listen and then we'll run an aggregating. So I want to be clear, right, what I'm saying before I see my name attached to something and they're aggregating it and they're not understanding. So I want to be
aggregators, Brian Lewis, equivalent of 2 first-round picks, and this was reported earlier in the offseason, so that could mean 1 first-round pick and a player who could have first-round pick value. So thank you for clearing that up. But talking about the rotation, because as we are at, you know, right now, starting the season in a few weeks, all these guys are on the roster, and Jordy said during his press conference on Thursday, I think he said that he was going to be comfortable going 9 or 10 deep in the rotation. Now, when you look at this rotation and when you look at the veterans that they have and a lot of the young guys that I think Nets fans are pretty passionately hoping get minutes, there's too many guys in too few spots right now for all of these guys to get minutes. Because if we're running down just like, say, the starting lineup is Simmons, Thomas, Johnson, Finney-Smith, and Claxton. Might be different, but just for numbers purposes, that's 5 guys. Then you got Dennis, Boyan once he's healthy. I think Jalen Wilson, Noah Clowney, Day'Ron Sharp, probably the guys who get those last rotation spots. That's 10. And then you got guys like Trendon Watford, who I know fans want to play this year and get significant more minutes than he did last year. You got Zaire Williams. You got Dariq Whitehead. That's 11, 12, and 13. So that's just a little bit of a picture of starting the season with all those veterans here. It's going to leave some guys that you would hope are going to get minutes for the Nets this year as the odd man out. So just how do you see it shaking out from that standpoint before these trades are made?
Oh, well, there's the caveat I was waiting to see. So yes, before trades are made, because we do expect that one or two players may be paired off this roster,
Mhm.
and some of the younger guys may have to wait in line. Uh, Also, again, Boyan isn't. I mean, he's not cleared yet.
Not even yet, not even for 5-on-5. So we
Right.
don't
So
know.
I don't know when he's playing.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know when he's going to play, and I don't know how many minutes he'll play coming out of the gate when he finally is cleared to play. But yes, he did say he'd like to play 9 or 10. That means there are probably an 11th man or 12th man that is going to have to wait or is going to have to struggle for their minutes. That's just the way it is. And there will be competition, which is only good. When competition is only useful. Now, what I would say is I do think at the beginning of the season, you are going to have some veteran players who know how to play, which probably will lead to a few extra wins that people aren't expecting.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, all the gambling houses are saying 19 and a half. And who knows, maybe by the end of the season, that's the kind of pace they may very well be on. But it wouldn't shock me when you have guys the caliber that you mentioned, that over the first month or two of the season, as things take shape, that they may be on a better pace than that. And they may surprise a few people by being a little bit more competitive than expected.
And, I think it's an interesting conversation also, just, with some guys, maybe some of the younger guys like Zaire Williams, Trendon Watford, Dariq Whitehead being the odd man out in the rotation. If you get into the guys that are in the rotation, how do some of those position battles and minutes shake out between the young guys versus the older guys who are starting games, who are closing games, who's prioritized in that regard? And, I think a good example of it would be because Dennis Schroeder or Ben Simmons starting point guard might be Ben Simmons, might be the favorite right now. Then we got Cam Thomas, probably Cam Johnson, probably at small forward, Nick Claxton at center, that power forward spot. You got Dorian Finney-Smith. And I think a lot of fans are probably hoping that spot goes to Noah Clowney to pair that front court tandem of the future alongside Nick Claxton, because we saw some exciting things in the last couple of weeks of last season out of that group. How do you envision? Is it a seniority nod to Dorian Finney-Smith at that starting power forward spot?
I hope not. And when I say that, I don't mean I'm not wishing ill on anybody or on Dorian. I'm saying if you are preaching competitiveness and competition at every turn, then you would hope that the best man wins, right? And if somebody earns minutes or earns playing time, then you would hope that they are rewarded with such. Now, if Dorian earns that, then he should play. But if Noah earns them, then you would hope that he would get his minutes. And by the way, I've heard that Noah actually looked really, really good in the open runs.
So you look great in summer league, so I would not be surprised at all. But that raises another interesting question, because let's say the fans get what they want and Noah Clowney is the starting power forward. And I want to throw in that, Dorian, you and I both know from covering him, one of the most team first guys that you're going to be around, and a guy who, well, I think is extremely competitive and wants to start as a veteran, not a guy who's going to cause problems and will do what, the team is, what the coaching staff wants to and what the team is requiring. So, but say Noah Clowney's, at the 4. Now Noah can shoot. Is he a high level NBA floor spacer yet? He looks like he has that kind of potential, but we don't know yet. But this goes along with what we're saying about, Jordy trying to put the best lineup together. If Ben Simmons is a starting point guard and Nick Claxton is a starting center, and then you're putting another near 7-footer at power forward in Noah Clowney, while they're hoping that he can space the floor. And then you got Cam Johnson at small forward, who we know shot creation, getting to the rim, all those things. He can do it in spots, but it's not his forte. Talk about a lot of pressure on Cam Thomas to be an engine of a half-court offense. We're talking about Cam Thomas with the ball, and in the half court, we're going to have Ben Simmons and Nick Claxton probably not spaced optimally because they just can't do that. And then you have another near 7-footer at power forward who really probably isn't taking a lot of NBA guys off the dribble or, you know, creating his own shot in that regard. That's a lot of size and, you know, not a lot of half-court shot creation. Now, I think Jordy's, if I was having a one-on-one with Jordy, I think his counter would be, look at the defensive end of the floor. We're going to have 3 near 7-footers who can switch onto the perimeter. We're going to rebound. We're going to run out in transition. So I get that, but that's not a recipe for success in a half-court offense in my eyes. And I think that that's putting a lot of pressure on Cam Thomas and maybe putting him in some positions that he might not be in, you know, throughout the rest of his NBA career. So that brings a question to me about, is that good for his development? Just, you know, what's your opinion on that potential pairing, you know, and that lineup with those issues?
Well, I am probably more curious than I should be about just how you determine how you're going to use Ben. Are you going to say, well, I need to surround him with floor spacers, and if that means not starting him, then that's what I have to do, and I put my best other starting unit on the floor? Or are you saying, well, okay, I'm going to play him with Nick, and that means I have to put the 3 best shooters I can find at 2, 3, and 4, even if those 3 best shooters I can find aren't necessarily my 3 best players that I can find? I really don't know. I really have no idea what Jordy would do there if he were forced to make that decision. That's why I asked him, and he said, I don't have to make that call today.
And this is going back.
We'll watch the preseason, and we'll see. And it also, by the way, may not be static. What we see on opening night, where is it, Atlanta?
Yeah.
May very well not be what you're seeing in game 7 or 12 or 17. He may say, well, I want to try this because I think potentially this is our highest upside, and I'm going to make you force me to stop playing this. I'm going to give you enough rope in every single opportunity to see if this works. I'm going to try it and try it and try it until you show me it doesn't work. You know, I don't know. I can't say that that's what he'll do, but that's always a possibility. What we see in Atlanta may not be what you see 2 weeks later.
Yeah, and that's true of any team. But, you know, just this all goes back to my point of, if you're making Ben the starting point guard, making concessions and crafting lineups around him after 2 years, 3 years now of severe back injuries and unavailability, you know, in a year where development of young prospects should be the priority. It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't compute to me. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, but let's move on because I think that's enough Ben Simmons talk. And let's round it out with this last question. Let's talk more about the sophomores, because I just said, and Sean Marks said it himself, he said, you know, if not 1A, it's certainly 1B. The development of these young guys is going to be the priority in this season. And to me, it should be 1A, and emphatically 1A. So the sophomores, you know, a guy like Noah Clowney, can he establish himself as an NBA starter? You know, if you're looking at guy like Jalen Wilson, can he establish himself as a rotation piece in the NBA? And then for a guy like Dariq Whitehead, the question might be, you know, after coming off of 2 lower leg surgeries, struggling a little bit in summer league, just trying to get his body back, can he get his body into a place where he can physically compete and start to round out the skill set to, you know, turn in productive NBA minutes and just gain some confidence? So those are the questions. But just talking about this sophomore class, what are your expectations and what would you like to see from these guys?
I would expect that, floor spacing aside, I think Noah has a chance to play a very significant role, whether that's starting at power forward or a platoon at power forward or inheriting it if Dorian gets moved, whatever. I think one way or the other, he will force Jordy to play him. I've heard he looked exceptionally good in the open runs. As far as Jalen, this goes back to the earlier conversation. For a team that's expected to lose a whole heap of games, there actually is some depth here and some tough decisions to be made when you're trying to craft a 9 or 10 man rotation out of their top 12 or 13. So it probably depends on who's available and who's healthy, but I certainly do think Jalen has a very reasonable shot to at least be in the rotation for parts of the season. He makes winning plays. There's a value to that. As far as Erik, it's tough for me to say. I mean, obviously, he didn't have the summer league that he would have wanted. He did not exactly cover himself in glory in Vegas. And physically, you have to get to the place where he can compete the way he wants to compete, right? That still seems to be something that he's working through. But also, you got to remember, he's still young. Some time in the G is not necessarily the worst thing that's ever happened. Yeah. Just look at how much Noah developed last year playing in the G League, and then look at where he was at the end of last season. Look at where he started the season and look at where he ended the season, right? So when you just look at the number of players that are NBA players, these are guys that have 100 games, 150 games, 200 games that are going to struggle to find minutes. It's very easy to see that Erik might struggle to find minutes over them. So some time in the G League would not be the worst thing that's ever happened.
No, it certainly wouldn't. And, just going from top to bottom, some things from me. Noah, heard the same things, that he looks great and not surprising at all. And I think just the things that you could be looking for from Noah are, obviously the 3-point shooting. The stroke looked very real in Vegas. A little bit different, obviously, when you transition to the NBA, but shot around 36%, shot very well in some games down the stretch in that last, final week or two of the NBA level last season. So can that stroke be for real? From everything I've seen, it looks like it will continue to develop. Can he improve, taking some guys off the dribble? Can he be able to attack closeouts and do some of those things that you need to do at power forward versus at center? I know he said last season that was going to be a focus of his development. And then just the question of, how do the Nets utilize him? Because a lot of Nets fans are very emphatic of, he's a power forward. He's a power forward. He's a power forward. And while I agree that that's where his highest upside is, I think Sean and Jordy were right to say that they don't want to pigeonhole him into anything, because I think a lot of, they would, and a lot of people who evaluated Noah would say that his versatility is his greatest strength. So his ability to, while he may play power forward, and that might be his feature position, to be able to throw him out in some small ball lineups and do some different things where you could utilize those growing aspects of his skill set down the line can only be a good thing, in my opinion. So, those are going to be things to watch out for. Jalen, I think for him, it's really just going to come down to can he space the floor at a high level in the NBA? If he can do that, he has the IQ. I think he has the defensive chops. He has the attitude and the motor to be a productive NBA player. And then I agree with everything you said for Erik. Erik played 4 games in Long Island last season, made, one real appearance with the Nets during that punted Milwaukee game. So, he's going to need time to get acclimated. And I think that putting him in the G League to do that, he's just, like you said, he's just got to get his body right first, because body isn't at a point where he can physically do the things that he needs to compete with these NBA level guys. And in terms of just athleticism, quickness, burst, all that, then none of it's going to matter. So he's got to get that right. And then when he's developing, rebuilding that skill set, doing it in Long Island and gaining some confidence, something that I don't think that he gained in Vegas this summer, that could only be a good thing for the Nets. And I think that that's a very realistic possibility, especially based on the early surplus of potential guys in the rotation that we alluded to earlier. So that's about it. But before we round it out, you asked a lot of great questions about the Nets win projection and got players' reactions to it. And I checked today, and if you can believe it, FanDuel has the Nets down to 18.5 over-under wins, which is the lowest in the NBA this season. It's also the lowest the Nets have had, I think, in 30 years. So I'm going to put you on the spot. Over-under, give me a win prediction for the Nets this season, and we'll circle back at the end of the year, and we'll evaluate. I'm going to give mine. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that they go over, which isn't saying a lot.
At 8, you're saying over under 18.5? That's what.
Yeah.
Was it FanDuel said?
That's what FanDuel's at now, which is pretty.
So they dropped it.
I think they can
drop
win,
even another.
Yeah, one more. I think they can win 20 games. Like I think that this team can do that. But
I would say over. I mean, I saw a 12-win team. This is not that. That team had no players. This is not that. This team is not. I mean, they're bad, but they are not utterly devoid of talent.
Yeah.
I would definitely take over at 18.5. Because, as I said, these veterans, other than Bogey, who right now, he's banged up, you do have a number of veterans who know how to play, right? And I do think they will eke out the occasional win early in the season that is unexpected. So I think they will be on a moderately surprising pace early in the season. Now, that could change come January, right? Because as we discussed, the trade market will open up. By the end of the season, I could certainly see them playing at that kind of pace. An 18-win pace, 19-win pace, 17-win pace, what have you, or less. But early on, I do think that they will bank a few wins that people weren't looking for that will have them finish the year over 18.5.
I definitely think that'll be the case early on, and we'll see how quickly the panic buttons are sounded amongst the Nets fan base if some of those wins start early. And like you said, like on top of the trade market, when we get towards the end of the season, like we've seen how tanking teams operate. I think Portland's a team that did it with Damian Lillard, and the Nets don't have a Damian Lillard. But if Cam Thomas has a sore anything at the end of the year, I wouldn't, the Nets say, Cam, take off, put your feet up, relax, take as much time as you need. Like that's the way that these things goes. As you say, players don't tank, organizations tank. So they know the goal, they know the task at hand, and I'm sure that they are going to try to put themselves in the best position long-term, which means landing a top selection in next June's draft. But Brian, appreciate you coming on. Always appreciate you taking your time out of the busy schedule to talk with us, and I will see you in Brooklyn tomorrow.
All right. See you at HSS tomorrow.
That does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. If you guys enjoyed the interview with Brian, please make sure to smash the like button, leave a 5-star review, subscribe, like, comment on YouTube, all of those things that really helps with the engagement of the show and helps drive up viewership as I try to build this channel and build this podcast viewership base. So really appreciate that if you can do it. I'm Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. You can follow all of my work on ClutchPoints.com, constant news, updates, analysis. Also follow me on Twitter at Erik Slater _ for all breaking news updates and all of my content to be posted there. Things are getting underway for the Nets, and it is a really exciting time of year for the NBA and the entire sports world. And I'll have more coverage of everything going on in Brooklyn here on Believe in Nets. I'll talk to you guys soon.